First, Tony, what do we know about this year's exercises?
Well, Garuda Shield exercise actually started in 2007. It was a bilateral Army-only exercise when it got started. It was between Indonesian Army and the U.S. Army Pacific. Now this year, as you said, 17 countries, and it's called Super Garuda Shield. The exercise itself involves taking advantage of Indonesia's vast jungle for land warfare, and it actually practice combat operations and live fires. And so it also has a second element, which involves civic affairs, where the forces go out there and they build schools, build roads. They use both the combat and civic affairs activities to improve the interoperability amongst all the participants.
Right, right. And so the question there, Tony, would be, what is this interoperability for?
I think it's important to respond to contingencies. I think Indonesia certainly wants to prepare itself to be a part of a coalition in case there's instability around the world, and Indonesia wants to be a part of that player. I think that's why they opened up the country and allowed the Garuda Shield to expand to such an international versus a bilateral exercise.
Brian, let's bring you in. So, the press release from Indonesia was careful to say that these exercises are not targeted to Russia and China, although those countries are not participating. Can you tell us about, this geostrategicness of Indonesia itself? It's home to, three of the world's largest choke points. That's the Malacca, Lombok, and Sunda Straits.
Yeah, that's right. And so Indonesia is geographically quite important located, but it's not as often discussed in the geopolitical framing regarding contention over the South China Seas, let's say, the way that with the Philippines or Vietnam, this often comes up, and as well as regarding Taiwan. But in terms of this cooperation, I think it's interesting to note how Indonesia is also at the juncture of many of the same influences contesting between the US and China. China is, of course, Indonesia's largest trading partner. And then in emphasizing that it is not targeted at China or Russia, Indonesia is then framing itself as, in the sense, I guess you could even say bipartisan, rather than focusing on aligning with the US against China at a time of rising tensions.
Tony, Indonesia is also part of one of the island chains, the second island chain. It's right at the bottom of that. So, what does that give it in terms of strategic, placement?
Well, the straits that you mentioned is important because if Malacca Strait and South China Sea gets blocked by China, then Lombok Strait becomes critical for the United States and Japan and Korea because the oil will have to go through Lombok Strait.
And understand that that's deep and wide enough to take those
Precisely.
vessels.
It's one of the straits that's deep enough to allow tankers to go through. So that's the strategic importance, as Brian mentioned, of Indonesia.
Brian, now it's said very specifically in relation to the tensions between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea that it has three principles. Firstly, protecting Indonesia's sovereignty. Secondly, protecting Indonesia's territorial integrity, and then maintaining its security. So, if you could tell us about these principles, but in relation to China's assertiveness and China's incursions into Indonesia's own EEZ.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think this is a rising issue for any country in the region. At the same time, this is very much in line with, for example, ASEAN, framing itself as not involving itself in disputes in the sense, being non-aligned and respecting sovereignty. And so Indonesia is framing this as its baseline, rather than trying to frame itself as, for example, poking China. I think particularly a lot of exercises that take place in the region will be framed by China one way or another. And so for Indonesia to dial back this kind of threat profile, this perception of threat, is something I think it emphasizes quite strongly.
And so you think that that is very strategic in doing that? It is trying to allow space or, create that cover for China that the Philippines is not doing?
I think so. I think particularly with the Philippines, for example, has become a very contested issue regarding the West Philippine Sea, disputed islands and reefs, and etc. I think Indonesia probably does not wish to get involved into that to that extent. It is interesting too. I mean, the history of Indonesia, for example, with regards to China, and particularly under the current administration, that could potentially come as an issue in Prabowo, for example. But I think that particularly trying to avoid getting to the same tensions that, let's say, Philippines has with China, that's probably priority, I think, right now for the government.
And what do you see in terms of the trends of those incursions? Do you see that this strategy is working?
I think it depends. I mean, I don't think that China particularly is focused on Indonesia in that sense. I think particularly there's a lot of stakeholders, and I think China is looking at the overall picture rather than focus on Indonesia per se. It's interesting too, I mean, I think in terms of the cooperation that one has seen between Indonesia and other powers, it's often framed along the lines of, let's say, counterterrorism rather than responding to a Chinese regional threat. Whereas I think with the Philippines or exercises such as the Rim of the Pacific, the element in which it is responding to China, even though it's claimed not to, I think is much more present.
Tony, but on that point, it's interesting that you have experience of being in China and actually seeing, Beijing's claim on essentially Indonesian territory. Can you tell us about that story?
Yeah, in 2005, I had a chance to go to China's Ministry of National Defense, and it's called August 1st Building, Bai Building. And as you walk in, there's a huge engraved map of China. And I remember noticing that 9-dash line actually went down to the Natuna Island, which belongs to Indonesia. I'm not sure if it's still that way because China is not enforcing that claim right now, although they claim the EEZ north of Natuna, which belongs to Indonesia. But at least at this point, I am not aware of the fact that China is trying to enforcing that claim, just like they're trying to do in the Second Thomas Shoal, for example. So I thought that was interesting. I know they caught my eye.
That has been the location, isn't it, Brian, for plenty of Chinese incursions. And I also understand that local fishermen there are very wary of China, especially China's Coast Guard, and they, like their Philippine counterparts, have been told to move on and basically leave these waters because they fall within Chinese waters.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it is possible this becomes contentious because I think particularly regarding the lives of everyday people such as fishermen, there's often public outrage. And so it does depend, but I don't think we're at the level of, for example, ships ramming each other in the way of occurs in the Philippines or firing water cannons upon, for example, Philippine vessels that are staking out territorial claims. And I think particularly there's a very strong demand from the public in the Philippines, which perhaps Indonesia may not, or the government may not want to see that because then it is pressured into taking action, perhaps.